Question 1. Governance review demonstrates that a prominent Alabama-based corporation is alleged to have engaged in activities that bear hallmarks of crimes against humanity, including systematic forced labor and widespread persecution of a minority group, occurring in a foreign nation. While the primary alleged acts took place abroad, evidence suggests that key decision-makers residing in Alabama may have directed or facilitated these actions. Financial transactions related to these alleged crimes passed through Alabama's banking system. Given these circumstances, what is the most appropriate initial course of action for an Alabama-based legal professional tasked with assessing the situation? Option A. Immediately report the allegations to the International Criminal Court, assuming that any conduct resembling crimes against humanity falls exclusively under its jurisdiction, regardless of the connection to Alabama. Option B. Thoroughly investigate the alleged conduct to determine if it constitutes crimes under Alabama's criminal statutes, paying particular attention to any provisions that may address aiding and abetting or conspiracy related to offenses with international implications, and simultaneously assess the potential for jurisdiction based on the presence of alleged perpetrators and financial activities within Alabama. Option C. Advise clients that Alabama courts have no jurisdiction over crimes committed entirely in foreign nations, and therefore, no further action is required within the state. Option D. Initiate a civil lawsuit against the corporation for corporate negligence, focusing solely on the financial losses incurred within Alabama, without addressing the international criminal law aspects of the alleged conduct. Correct answer is B. Thoroughly investigate the alleged conduct to determine if it constitutes crimes under Alabama's criminal statutes, paying particular attention to any provisions that may address aiding and abetting or conspiracy related to offenses with international implications, and simultaneously assess the potential for jurisdiction based on the presence of alleged perpetrators and financial activities within Alabama. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the potential for conflicting legal obligations and the need to uphold principles of international criminal law while operating within the specific framework of Alabama's regulatory environment. The core difficulty lies in identifying and applying the correct legal basis for action when faced with allegations of international crimes that may have connections to Alabama. Professionals must exercise careful judgment to ensure compliance with both domestic and international legal standards, avoiding actions that could be construed as complicity or obstruction. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough assessment of the alleged conduct against the principles of international criminal law, specifically focusing on whether the actions constitute crimes within the recognized jurisdiction of international tribunals, or if they fall under the purview of Alabama's domestic criminal statutes that may incorporate international offenses. This approach prioritizes establishing a clear legal nexus to Alabama and identifying the most appropriate legal framework for investigation and potential prosecution. This aligns with the principle of complementarity, where international courts act when national courts are unwilling or unable to prosecute. Furthermore, it respects the sovereignty of Alabama while acknowledging the gravity of international crimes. Incorrect approach is analysis. Pursuing an investigation solely under Alabama's general criminal statutes without considering the international dimension would be an insufficient approach. While some international crimes may be codified in state law, a failure to recognize the international criminal law principles at play could lead to an incomplete investigation or an inappropriate legal framework, potentially missing key elements required for prosecuting international offenses. Initiating an investigation based on a presumption that Alabama courts automatically have jurisdiction over all international crimes, regardless of the specific nexus, would be an overreach. Jurisdiction in international criminal law is complex and often relies on principles like territoriality, nationality, or universal jurisdiction, which must be carefully established. Ignoring the allegations entirely due to their international nature and assuming they are outside Alabama's purview would be a dereliction of professional duty. While direct prosecution of all international crimes by state courts may not always be feasible, there is an ethical and potentially legal obligation to assess the situation and cooperate with appropriate authorities if a clear connection to Alabama exists and domestic statutes can be applied. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic decision-making process. First, they must identify the alleged conduct and its potential classification under international criminal law. Second, they must meticulously examine the factual connections to Alabama to determine if any jurisdictional basis exists under state law, or if cooperation with federal or international bodies is warranted. Third, they should consult relevant Alabama statutes and case law pertaining to international crimes or offenses with international implications. Finally, they must act in accordance with the established legal framework, prioritizing due process and the principles of justice. Question 2. Regulatory review indicates that an individual in Alabama is alleged to have facilitated the transfer of certain goods that were subsequently outlawed by Alabama legislation, enacted 6 months after the facilitation occurred. The prosecution is considering charging the individual under this new legislation, arguing that the act of facilitating the transfer, even if not explicitly criminal at the time, should be punishable. What is the most appropriate course of action for the prosecution? Option A. Decline prosecution, as the conduct was not a criminal offense under Alabama law at the time it was committed, thus violating the principle of nulla pona sine lege. Option B. Seek an immediate amendment to the legislation to explicitly criminalize the past conduct retroactively. Option C. Pursue charges based on general principles of aiding and abetting, even though no specific crime related to the goods existed at the time of facilitation. Option D. Proceed with prosecution under the new legislation, asserting that the legislature's intent was to address such past conduct. The correct answer is A. Decline prosecution, as the conduct was not a criminal offense under Alabama law at the time it was committed, thus violating the principle of nulla pona sine lege. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves a novel application of criminal law to conduct that occurred prior to the enactment of the specific statute under which prosecution is being considered. The core tension lies between the state's interest in holding individuals accountable for harmful actions and the fundamental principle of nulla pona sine lege, which protects individuals from being punished for acts that were not criminalized at the time they were committed. Navigating this requires a deep understanding of Alabama's statutory interpretation principles and constitutional protections. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach is to refuse to prosecute based on the principle of nulla pona sine lege, as enshrined in both Alabama and federal constitutional law. This principle mandates that criminal offenses and their punishment must be clearly defined by law before the conduct occurs. Since the alleged act of facilitating the transfer of prohibited goods was not a defined criminal offense under Alabama law at the time it was committed, prosecuting the individual under the subsequently enacted statute would violate this fundamental legal safeguard. This approach upholds due process and prevents arbitrary application of law. Incorrect approach is analysis. Prosecuting the individual under the new statute, arguing that the legislature intended to capture past conduct, fails to respect the principle of nulla pona sine lege. This approach wrongly assumes retroactive application of criminal law, which is generally disfavored and constitutionally suspect unless explicitly stated and permissible. Disregards the protection against ex post facto laws. Another incorrect approach would be to argue that the general prohibition against aiding and abetting criminal activity, even without a specific statute for the prohibited goods at the time, is sufficient grounds for prosecution. While aiding and abetting is a recognized legal concept, it typically requires an underlying criminal offense to have been committed or be in the process of being committed. In this case, the act of facilitating the transfer of goods was not criminal at the time, so there was no predicate crime to aid or abet. A further incorrect approach would be to seek an expedited legislative amendment to criminalize the past conduct retroactively. This is ethically and legally impermissible, as it attempts to circumvent the constitutional prohibition against ex post facto laws, and undermines the rule of law by creating a law specifically to punish past actions. Professional reasoning. Professionals faced with such a situation must prioritize adherence to established legal principles and constitutional protections over the desire to achieve a particular outcome. The decision-making process should involve a thorough review of the relevant statutes, case law concerning retroactivity and ex post facto laws in Alabama, and the fundamental principles of criminal justice. When a proposed prosecution directly conflicts with a core legal safeguard, like nulla pona sine lege, the professional obligation is to decline prosecution and clearly articulate the legal basis for that decision, thereby upholding the integrity of the justice system. Question 3. Performance analysis shows that a foreign national, while residing temporarily in a neighboring U.S. state, allegedly committed acts that constitute grave breaches of international humanitarian law, including torture and systematic attacks against a civilian population, with the victims being citizens of a third country. Considering the Alabama International Criminal Law exam context, what is the most appropriate initial course of action for an Alabama-based legal professional to consider regarding potential prosecution? Option A. Attempt to prosecute the individual in Alabama by directly applying the principles of international criminal law without first confirming federal or state jurisdictional authority. Option B. Immediately initiate prosecution in an Alabama state court, applying Alabama criminal statutes to the alleged acts. Option C. Consult with federal authorities and legal experts in international law and extradition to determine federal jurisdiction and appropriate prosecutorial channels. Option D. Dismiss the matter entirely, asserting that Alabama courts lack jurisdiction over international crimes. The correct answer is C. Consult with federal authorities and legal experts in international law and extradition to determine federal jurisdiction and appropriate prosecutorial channels. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires distinguishing between acts that constitute international crimes and those that fall within the purview of domestic Alabama law, particularly when the alleged perpetrator is a foreign national and the acts occurred outside of Alabama. The core difficulty lies in establishing jurisdiction for international criminal law principles within the context of Alabama's legal framework, which primarily operates under state and federal U.S. law. Careful judgment is required to avoid misapplying international legal concepts or overstepping jurisdictional boundaries. The correct approach involves recognizing that, while Alabama courts primarily handle state law matters, the concept of universal jurisdiction, where certain international crimes can be prosecuted by any state regardless of where the crime occurred or the nationality of the perpetrator or victim, is a principle of international law. However, for Alabama courts to exercise jurisdiction over such matters, there must be a clear nexus or connection to Alabama, or the prosecution must be authorized under specific federal statutes that incorporate international criminal law principles and grant jurisdiction to state courts under certain circumstances. In this case, the most appropriate approach is to consult with federal authorities and legal experts specializing in international law and extradition to determine if federal jurisdiction exists, and if the matter should be pursued through federal channels, or if there is a specific, albeit rare, basis for state-level prosecution under Alabama law that aligns with international criminal law principles. This acknowledges the primacy of federal jurisdiction in most international criminal matters and ensures proper legal channels are followed. An incorrect approach would be to directly initiate prosecution in an Alabama state court solely based on the alleged commission of an act that might be considered a grave breach of international humanitarian law, without first establishing a clear basis for Alabama's jurisdiction under state or federal law. This fails to account for the complexities of international jurisdiction and the typical division of prosecutorial authority between state and federal governments in the United States concerning international crimes. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the matter entirely, arguing that Alabama courts have no jurisdiction over international crimes. While direct state jurisdiction is uncommon, certain international crimes can have domestic implications or be prosecuted under federal statutes that may, in specific instances, involve state cooperation or be adjudicated in state courts under federal delegation. A blanket dismissal ignores potential avenues for justice. A further incorrect approach is to attempt to apply Alabama criminal statutes directly to acts that are primarily defined and prosecuted under international criminal law, without considering the specific elements and jurisdictional requirements of international law. This risks misinterpreting the nature of the alleged offense and failing to meet the burden of proof required for international crimes. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes jurisdictional analysis. This involves 1. Identifying the alleged offense and its classification under both domestic Alabama and federal U.S. and international law. 2. Researching the specific jurisdictional basis for prosecution under Alabama law, federal law, and relevant international treaties or customary international law. 3. Consulting with federal agencies, e.g., Department of Justice and legal counsel experienced in international criminal law and extradition. 4. Determining the most appropriate forum for prosecution based on established legal principles and prosecutorial discretion. Question 4. Market research demonstrates that the principle of legality is paramount in criminal jurisprudence. An attorney in Alabama is reviewing a case where a new technology was used to commit an act that, while harmful, is not explicitly defined as a crime in any existing Alabama statute. The attorney is considering whether to pursue charges by arguing that the act falls within the spirit of existing laws against fraud or deception, even though the specific conduct is not enumerated. Which of the following approaches best upholds the principle of legality under Alabama law? Option A. Seek legislative amendment to create a new criminal offense that covers the described conduct, and then prosecute the individual once the amendment is enacted. Option B. Prosecute the individual based on a clear and specific Alabama statute that directly prohibits the conduct in question, ensuring the law was in effect at the time of the alleged act and provided fair notice. Option C. Prosecute the individual by interpreting existing fraud statutes broadly to encompass the new technological act, arguing that the legislature would have intended to cover such conduct if it had foreseen it. Option D. Advise against prosecution, as there is no Alabama statute that specifically and clearly defines the described conduct as a criminal offense, thus preventing the retroactive creation of a crime. The correct answer is B. Prosecute the individual based on a clear and specific Alabama statute that directly prohibits the conduct in question, ensuring the law was in effect at the time of the alleged act and provided fair notice. Explanation. Market research demonstrates that the principle of legality is a cornerstone of criminal law, ensuring that individuals are only punished for conduct that was clearly defined as criminal by law at the time it was committed. This principle, deeply embedded in Alabama's legal framework, requires that criminal statutes be clear, specific, and accessible, preventing arbitrary enforcement and ex post facto application of laws. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a legal professional to navigate the tension between a potentially broad interpretation of a statute and the fundamental right to be informed of what constitutes criminal conduct. The challenge lies in upholding the principle of legality, which demands precision and predictability in criminal law, against pressures that might favor a more expansive and potentially retroactive application of the law. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any prosecution aligns strictly with pre-existing, clearly defined criminal offenses under Alabama law. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves strictly adhering to the principle of legality as understood within Alabama's criminal justice system. This means that any prosecution must be based on a statute that clearly and specifically prohibited the conduct in question at the time it occurred. The law must be sufficiently defined to give fair notice to ordinary people of what conduct is criminal. This approach is correct because it directly upholds the constitutional and statutory mandates of Alabama law, which prohibit vague criminal statutes and ex post facto laws. It ensures that individuals are not subjected to criminal liability for actions that were not clearly prescribed by law prior to their commission, thereby safeguarding fundamental rights and the rule of law. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to prosecute based on an interpretation of a statute that extends its meaning beyond its plain language or established precedent, particularly if this interpretation was not foreseeable at the time of the alleged conduct. This fails to provide fair notice and violates the principle of legality by retroactively criminalizing conduct. Another incorrect approach would be to rely on common law notions of criminal intent or public policy to create a new criminal offense or expand an existing one without clear statutory authorization. Alabama law requires that criminal offenses be defined by statute, and courts cannot create new crimes by judicial interpretation. A further incorrect approach would be to prosecute based on a statute that is so vague or overly broad that it fails to give fair notice of what conduct is prohibited, allowing for arbitrary and discriminatory enforcement. Such statutes are unconstitutional under Alabama law and the principle of legality. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that prioritizes strict adherence to statutory language and established legal precedent. When faced with ambiguous statutes, the default position should be to interpret them narrowly in favor of the accused, particularly in criminal matters. This involves a thorough review of the relevant Alabama statutes, legislative intent, and case law to determine if the conduct in question clearly falls within the scope of a pre-existing, well-defined criminal offense. If there is doubt, or if the prosecution would require a significant expansion or reinterpretation of the law, professionals must decline to prosecute or advise against such action to uphold the principle of legality. Question 5. Cost-benefit analysis shows that implementing a new sentencing guideline in Alabama that reduces penalties for a specific offense could be beneficial for offenders. An attorney in Alabama is representing a client who committed this offense prior to the enactment of the new guideline. What is the most appropriate legal advice the attorney should provide regarding the application of the new, more lenient penalty to their client's past conduct? Option A. Advise the client that the new, more lenient penalty can be applied retroactively because it is a more favorable outcome for the offender. Option B. Recommend that the client wait for the Alabama courts to clarify the retroactivity of the new law before making any decisions. Option C. Suggest the client argue for the application of the new law based on general principles of fairness and equity. Option D. Advise the client that the new, more lenient penalty cannot be applied retroactively to their past conduct, as the law in effect at the time of the offense governs. The correct answer is D. Advise the client that the new, more lenient penalty cannot be applied retroactively to their past conduct, as the law in effect at the time of the offense governs. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an attorney to navigate the fundamental principle of non-retroactivity of criminal law in Alabama. Misinterpreting or disregarding this principle can lead to severe ethical breaches and legal consequences, including the potential for ineffective assistance of counsel and disciplinary action. The attorney must exercise careful judgment to ensure their advice aligns with established Alabama law and constitutional protections. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves advising the client that the new, more lenient penalty cannot be applied retroactively to their past conduct. This is because the principle of non-retroactivity, enshrined in both the United States Constitution, ex post facto clause, and Alabama law, prohibits the application of a criminal statute to acts committed before its enactment, especially if the new law imposes a harsher penalty. While this specific instance involves a more lenient penalty, the underlying principle of certainty in criminal law and the prohibition against ex post facto laws generally mean that the law in effect at the time of the offense governs. Alabama courts have consistently upheld this principle. Therefore, advising the client based on the law at the time of their offense is the legally sound and ethically required course of action. Incorrect approach is analysis. Advising the client that the new, more lenient penalty can be applied retroactively is incorrect because it misapplies the principle of non-retroactivity. While the new law is more favorable, the general rule in criminal law is that the law in effect at the time of the commission of the crime applies. Retroactively applying a more lenient law, while seemingly beneficial, can still create uncertainty and is not a guaranteed right unless explicitly provided for by statute or judicial interpretation in specific circumstances not present here. This approach risks misleading the client and potentially violating their rights if the state were to argue against such retroactive application. Suggesting that the client could attempt to argue for the application of the new law based on fairness, without acknowledging the established legal precedent on non-retroactivity, is also incorrect. While fairness is a consideration in the justice system, it cannot override fundamental legal principles like non-retroactivity. This approach fails to provide accurate legal counsel and could lead the client to pursue a futile legal strategy, wasting their resources and potentially damaging their case. Recommending that the client simply wait for the new law to be tested in the courts before making any decisions, without providing clear advice on the current legal standing, is an abdication of professional responsibility. While waiting for judicial clarification can sometimes be a strategy, an attorney has a duty to provide their client with the best available advice based on existing law. This approach fails to offer concrete guidance and leaves the client in a state of uncertainty, which is not conducive to effective legal representation. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by first identifying the core legal principle at play in this case, non-retroactivity. They must then consult the relevant statutes and case law of the specific jurisdiction, Alabama, to understand how this principle is applied. The next step is to analyze the facts of the client's case in light of the law. Finally, the professional must communicate the legal analysis clearly and accurately to the client, outlining the applicable law, potential outcomes, and recommended course of action, always prioritizing adherence to established legal and ethical standards. Question 6. The control framework reveals that a prosecutor in Alabama is considering charging an individual with a new form of online fraud that has emerged recently. While the conduct is undeniably harmful and exploitative, no Alabama statute specifically enumerates this precise type of fraudulent activity as a distinct crime. The prosecutor believes that the general intent of existing fraud statutes could be interpreted to encompass this new behavior. What is the most legally sound and ethically responsible course of action for the prosecutor to take in Alabama? Option A. Pursue charges by arguing for a broad interpretation of existing fraud statutes, asserting that the legislature's intent was to cover all forms of fraudulent activity, including this new manifestation. Option B. Seek legislative action to create a new statute that specifically criminalizes this type of online fraud before initiating any prosecution. Option C. Refrain from bringing charges unless a specific Alabama statute clearly defines the alleged conduct as criminal, thereby upholding the principle of nullum crimen sine lege. Option D. Proceed with prosecution based on the harmful nature of the conduct and the public's expectation that such behavior should be punished, even in the absence of a precisely applicable statute. The correct answer is C. Refrain from bringing charges unless a specific Alabama statute clearly defines the alleged conduct as criminal, thereby upholding the principle of nullum crimen sine lege. Explanation. The control framework reveals a scenario that is professionally challenging due to the inherent tension between the principle of nullum crimen sine lege and the potential for evolving legal interpretations or the application of broad statutory language to novel conduct. A prosecutor in Alabama must exercise careful judgment to ensure that any prosecution adheres strictly to established law, preventing arbitrary or retrospective criminalization. The correct approach involves a rigorous legal analysis to determine if the alleged conduct clearly falls within the scope of an existing Alabama statute that defines the offense with sufficient clarity and specificity. This approach is correct because the principle of nullum crimen sine lege, as understood within Alabama law and general principles of criminal justice, mandates that individuals can only be punished for conduct that was clearly prohibited by law at the time it was committed. This requires that the law be accessible, understandable, and not overly vague or ambiguous. A prosecutor must be able to point to a specific statute that criminalizes the precise act in question, leaving no room for interpretation that expands the reach of criminal law beyond its legislative intent. An incorrect approach would be to prosecute based on a broad interpretation of a statute that was not clearly intended to cover the specific conduct, or to rely on judicial precedent that retroactively criminalizes behavior. This fails to uphold the principle of legality by effectively creating a new crime after the fact, violating the requirement that laws be clear and prospective. Another incorrect approach would be to proceed with prosecution based on public outcry or a perceived moral wrong, even if no specific statute clearly prohibits the conduct. This prioritizes public sentiment over established legal principles, undermining the rule of law and the predictability of criminal justice. Professional reasoning in such situations requires a commitment to the rule of law and the fundamental rights of individuals. Prosecutors should first identify the specific statute under which prosecution is contemplated. They must then critically assess whether the alleged facts constitute an offense as defined by that statute, considering its plain language, legislative history, and any relevant judicial interpretations. If there is ambiguity or if the conduct appears to fall outside the clear intent of the law, the prosecutor should refrain from bringing charges, even if the conduct is undesirable. This decision-making process prioritizes legal certainty and fairness over expediency or popular pressure. Question 7. Stakeholder feedback indicates a need to refine the assessment of individual criminal responsibility in cases involving alleged international crimes prosecuted under Alabama law. A prosecutor is reviewing evidence against an individual accused of complicity in war crimes committed abroad. The evidence suggests the individual provided logistical support to a group engaged in these activities and was aware that the group was involved in some form of illicit operations. However, direct evidence of the individual's specific intent to facilitate the commission of war crimes, as opposed to general awareness of the group's activities, is limited. Which of the following approaches best reflects the necessary legal standard for establishing individual criminal responsibility under Alabama law in this context? Option A. Argue that the individual's logistical support and general awareness of illicit operations are sufficient to establish complicity, given the grave nature of the alleged international crimes. Option B. Assume criminal responsibility based on the individual's association with the group and their presence in a supporting role, without requiring proof of specific intent to facilitate the war crimes. Option C. Focus on demonstrating that the individual acted with the specific intent to aid, abet, or encourage the commission of the international war crimes, or possess knowledge of the essential facts constituting the war crimes and intended to assist in their commission. Option D. Rely on the fact that international crimes were committed by the group to infer the individual's intent to participate in those specific crimes, even without direct evidence of their mental state. The correct answer is C. Focus on demonstrating that the individual acted with the specific intent to aid, abet, or encourage the commission of the international war crimes, or possess knowledge of the essential facts constituting the war crimes and intended to assist in their commission. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires navigating the complexities of individual criminal responsibility under Alabama law, specifically concerning the mens rea element for complicity in international crimes. The prosecutor must meticulously assess the defendant's mental state and intent to ensure a conviction aligns with Alabama's statutory framework for criminal liability, particularly regarding aiding and abetting or conspiracy, as applied to alleged international offenses. A failure to properly establish the requisite intent could lead to an acquittal, undermining justice. The best approach involves a thorough examination of the defendant's knowledge and intent regarding the specific international criminal acts. This requires demonstrating that the defendant acted with the specific intent to facilitate or encourage the commission of the international crime, or that they possessed knowledge of the essential facts that would constitute the international crime and intended to aid in its commission. This aligns with Alabama's general principles of criminal liability, which often require proof of intent or knowledge, and is crucial when applying these principles to acts that may have occurred outside of Alabama, but are being prosecuted under its jurisdiction, assuming jurisdiction is properly established. The focus must be on the defendant's subjective mental state and their direct or indirect contribution to the criminal enterprise. An approach that focuses solely on the defendant's presence at the scene or their general awareness of illicit activities, without proving specific intent to aid or abet the international crime, is legally insufficient. Alabama law, like most jurisdictions, requires more than mere association or passive observation to establish complicity. Without evidence of the defendant's intent to assist in the commission of the international crime, or knowledge that their actions would contribute to such a crime, a conviction for complicity would be unsupported. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that because the international crime occurred and the defendant was involved in some capacity, that criminal responsibility automatically attaches. This overlooks the fundamental requirement to prove individual culpability and the specific mental state necessary for the charged offense under Alabama law. It risks convicting individuals based on association rather than proven intent. Finally, an approach that relies on generalized assumptions about the nature of international crime, without concrete evidence linking the defendant's actions and mental state to those specific crimes, is also flawed. Alabama's criminal justice system demands that charges be proven with specific evidence, and this principle extends to the application of its laws to international criminal acts. Professionals should employ a framework that begins with identifying the specific elements of the crime charged under Alabama law, then meticulously gathering evidence to prove each element, with a particular emphasis on establishing the defendant's mens rea through direct or circumstantial evidence, and considering the specific intent required for complicity or conspiracy. Question 8. The efficiency study reveals that a prominent Alabama-based corporation, operating internationally, is facing potential liability in a foreign jurisdiction for actions that may contravene established principles of customary international law, even though no specific treaty or Alabama statute directly addresses such conduct. In advising the corporation on its potential exposure and defense strategies under Alabama law, which of the following approaches best reflects the proper application of legal principles? Option A. Focus solely on Alabama's statutory framework and any Alabama Supreme Court decisions that might tangentially relate to international business practices, disregarding any principles of customary international law that are not explicitly codified within Alabama's domestic legislation. Option B. Recommend that the corporation unilaterally define its understanding of international legal obligations based on its own internal ethical guidelines and industry best practices, arguing that this self-regulation supersedes any potential claims based on uncodified customary international law. Option C. Ascertain the existence and content of the alleged customary international law norm by examining consistent state practice, opinio juris, and relevant pronouncements from international tribunals and authoritative legal scholarship, and then assess how such a norm, if established, would be recognized and applied within the framework of U.S. federal law, and consequently, Alabama's legal system. Option D. Advise the corporation that since no specific Alabama statute or treaty explicitly prohibits the conduct in question, and Alabama courts have not directly ruled on this specific aspect of customary international law, the corporation faces no actionable liability under Alabama law. The correct answer is C. Ascertain the existence and content of the alleged customary international law norm by examining consistent state practice, opinio juris, and relevant pronouncements from international tribunals and authoritative legal scholarship, and then assess how such a norm, if established, would be recognized and applied within the framework of U.S. federal law, and consequently, Alabama's legal system. Explanation. The efficiency study reveals a critical juncture in the application of international law within Alabama's legal framework, specifically concerning the recognition and enforcement of customary international law. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires legal professionals to navigate the complex interplay between domestic state law and evolving international norms, particularly when those norms are not explicitly codified in treaties or statutes. The absence of clear, universally agreed upon interpretations of customary international law adds a layer of ambiguity that demands careful judgment and a robust understanding of legal precedent and scholarly consensus. The best approach involves a thorough examination of Alabama's constitutional provisions and statutory framework to determine the extent to which customary international law is recognized and how it is applied. This requires consulting authoritative sources that define and evidence customary international law, such as the Restatement Third of the Foreign Relations Law of the United States, decisions of international tribunals, and the consistent practice of states. The justification for this approach lies in Alabama's adherence to the Supremacy Clause of the U.S. Constitution, which generally subordinates state law to federal law, including treaties and, by extension, recognized principles of international law that have become part of federal common law. Furthermore, Alabama courts are bound by the decisions of federal courts on matters of federal law and international law. Therefore, aligning with established federal jurisprudence on the recognition of customary international law is paramount. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on Alabama-specific statutes or judicial decisions that may not directly address the recognition of customary international law. This fails to acknowledge that the recognition and application of international law are primarily federal matters, and state courts must interpret and apply it within the framework established by federal law. Another incorrect approach would be to disregard customary international law entirely if it is not explicitly mentioned in Alabama's codified laws. This overlooks the principle that customary international law, once recognized as binding under U.S. federal law, can preempt or inform state law. Finally, an approach that attempts to unilaterally define or interpret customary international law based on subjective interpretations or limited regional practices, without reference to broader state practice and opinio juris, would be professionally unacceptable. This disregards the fundamental requirements for the formation and recognition of customary international law, which necessitate widespread and consistent state practice, coupled with a belief that such practice is legally obligatory. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with identifying the relevant legal question. They must then research the applicable federal law and relevant Alabama law, paying close attention to how federal courts have addressed the recognition and application of customary international law. This involves consulting authoritative legal scholarship and international legal sources to establish the existence and content of any relevant customary international law. The analysis should then focus on how these principles interact with Alabama's legal system, considering potential preemption or interpretive guidance. Question 9. The audit findings indicate that a company with significant operations in Alabama may have engaged in fraudulent financial reporting that directly impacted investors in Alabama, even though the primary fraudulent acts occurred outside the United States. Considering the general principles of law governing jurisdiction in Alabama, what is the most appropriate initial step to assess the state's authority to investigate and potentially prosecute this matter? Option A. Consult with legal counsel specializing in international law and Alabama criminal procedure to determine if any specific Alabama statute or established legal precedent supports extraterritorial jurisdiction in this context. Option B. Dismiss the matter as falling outside Alabama's jurisdiction, as all primary fraudulent acts occurred internationally. Option C. Immediately initiate a criminal investigation and seek to extradite any individuals involved, assuming Alabama law applies to all fraudulent acts affecting its residents. Option D. Rely solely on federal statutes governing international fraud, as state jurisdiction is presumed to be limited to conduct within Alabama's borders. The correct answer is A. Consult with legal counsel specializing in international law and Alabama criminal procedure to determine if any specific Alabama statute or established legal precedent supports extraterritorial jurisdiction in this context. Explanation. The audit findings indicate a potential violation of Alabama's general principles of law concerning the extraterritorial application of its statutes, specifically in relation to international criminal matters. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of jurisdiction, the presumption against extraterritoriality, and the specific intent of Alabama's legislature when enacting criminal statutes. Professionals must carefully consider whether Alabama law can, or is intended to, reach conduct occurring entirely outside the state's borders, especially when dealing with international actors or events. The correct approach involves recognizing that Alabama criminal statutes are generally presumed to apply only within the territorial boundaries of Alabama, unless there is clear legislative intent to the contrary, or a specific statutory provision addressing extraterritorial reach. The state's jurisdiction is limited to acts committed within its physical borders. This principle is fundamental to the concept of territorial jurisdiction in criminal law. Applying this to the scenario, the most appropriate action is to consult with legal counsel specializing in international law and Alabama criminal procedure to determine if any specific Alabama statute or established legal precedent supports extraterritorial jurisdiction in this particular context. This approach prioritizes legal accuracy and adherence to established jurisdictional principles. An incorrect approach would be to assume that Alabama law automatically applies to any individual or entity with any connection, however tenuous, to Alabama, regardless of where the criminal conduct occurred. This ignores the presumption against extraterritoriality and could lead to an overreach of state authority, potentially violating due process principles and international comity. Another incorrect approach would be to immediately initiate criminal proceedings based solely on the audit findings, without a thorough legal analysis of jurisdictional grounds. This demonstrates a lack of professional diligence and a failure to properly assess the legal basis for state action. It risks pursuing a case that is legally untenable from the outset. A further incorrect approach would be to dismiss the audit findings entirely, arguing that Alabama law has no application to international matters. While the presumption against extraterritoriality is strong, there may be specific, albeit rare, circumstances or statutory exceptions that could grant Alabama jurisdiction. A blanket dismissal without investigation is professionally negligent. The professional reasoning process should involve a systematic evaluation of jurisdictional principles. First, identify the alleged conduct and its location. Second, determine the relevant Alabama statutes. Third, assess whether these statutes contain any explicit provisions for extraterritorial application. Fourth, if no explicit provision exists, consider whether established legal precedent or the underlying purpose of the statute strongly implies extraterritorial reach. Fifth, if jurisdiction remains uncertain, seek expert legal advice before taking any action. This structured approach ensures that decisions are grounded in sound legal analysis and respect for jurisdictional boundaries. Question 10. Compliance review shows that a business owner in Mobile, Alabama, engaged in a series of transactions where they misrepresented the condition of goods to buyers, resulting in financial losses for those buyers. The owner claims they were unaware of the full extent of the defects and believed they were acting in good faith, though their due diligence was minimal. If the total value of the misrepresented goods was $50,000 and the owner's profit margin on these goods was 20%, calculate the potential financial gain the owner realized from these deceptive transactions, assuming the profit margin was applied to the sale price. Option A, $50,000. Option B, $10,000. Option C, $40,000. Option D, $60,000. The correct answer is B, $10,000. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge in determining the requisite intent for a criminal offense under Alabama law, specifically concerning the acquisition of property through deceptive means. The core difficulty lies in distinguishing between mere negligence or recklessness and the specific intent to defraud, which is a crucial element for conviction. Alabama statutes, like many jurisdictions, require proof of a particular mental state for criminal liability, and misinterpreting this can lead to incorrect legal conclusions and potentially flawed advice. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a meticulous examination of the evidence to ascertain if the individual possessed the specific intent to deprive the owner of their property permanently or for an extended period through deceit. This requires looking for direct or circumstantial evidence that demonstrates a conscious objective to mislead. For instance, evidence of pre-planning, the creation of false documents, or prior similar acts could indicate such intent. Under Alabama law, particularly in fraud-related offenses, the prosecution must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant acted with the intent to deceive and to cause financial loss. This approach aligns with the principles of mens rea, requiring a guilty mind to accompany a guilty act. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that the mere fact of deception leading to financial loss is sufficient for criminal intent. This overlooks the legal requirement for a specific mental state. Alabama law distinguishes between different levels of culpability. Recklessness or negligence in a transaction, while potentially leading to civil liability, may not rise to the level of criminal intent required for fraud. Another incorrect approach is to focus solely on the outcome of the transaction, without adequately assessing the defendant's state of mind at the time the deceptive acts were committed. The intent must exist at the time of the alleged offense, not merely be inferred from subsequent events or the financial consequences. A further incorrect approach is to equate a lack of due diligence or a poor business decision with criminal intent. While a defendant may have acted unwisely or failed to conduct thorough investigations, this does not automatically translate to an intent to defraud. The evidence must point to a deliberate plan to mislead. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured decision-making process that begins with identifying the specific elements of the alleged offense under Alabama law. This includes understanding the precise definition of intent required. Subsequently, they must gather and analyze all available evidence, both direct and circumstantial, to determine if each element, particularly the intent requirement, can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. If the evidence is insufficient to establish specific intent, then a conclusion of no criminal liability for that specific intent-based offense is warranted. This analytical framework ensures adherence to legal standards and protects against misapplication of the law. Question 11. The assessment process reveals that an Alabama state court is tasked with interpreting a federal statute concerning international money laundering. While there is no direct precedent from the U.S. Supreme Court or the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals specifically addressing the international aspects of this statute, the court has encountered decisions from international tribunals and scholarly articles discussing customary international law principles related to money laundering. Considering the principles of federal supremacy and the role of international law in interpreting domestic statutes, what is the most appropriate approach for the Alabama court to take in its interpretation? Option A. Directly apply the principles and rulings from international tribunals and customary international law as binding precedent for the interpretation of the federal statute, overriding any potential ambiguity in federal law. Option B. Primarily rely on prior Alabama state court decisions that have interpreted similar federal statutes, even if those decisions did not directly address the international dimensions of money laundering. Option C. Carefully analyze the federal statute's text and legislative intent, and then consider relevant international case law and scholarly commentary as persuasive authority to inform the interpretation, ensuring consistency with established federal law. Option D. Disregard all international case law and scholarly commentary, focusing solely on the plain text of the federal statute without considering any broader legal context. The correct answer is C. Carefully analyze the federal statute's text and legislative intent, and then consider relevant international case law and scholarly commentary as persuasive authority to inform the interpretation, ensuring consistency with established federal law. Explanation: the assessment process reveals a scenario that is professionally challenging due to the inherent tension between a state court's interpretation of a federal statute and the evolving body of international criminal law precedent. Alabama courts, like all state courts, are bound by the Supremacy Clause of the U.S. Constitution to uphold federal law. However, the application of international criminal law principles, particularly those derived from international tribunals and customary international law, can create ambiguity when a state court is tasked with interpreting a federal statute that has international implications. The professional challenge lies in discerning when and how international jurisprudence should inform the interpretation of domestic law, especially when direct federal appellate precedent is absent or unclear. Careful judgment is required to avoid misinterpreting federal law or overreaching the bounds of state judicial authority. The best professional approach involves a rigorous analysis of the specific federal statute in question, seeking to understand its legislative intent and how it has been interpreted by federal courts. When federal appellate precedent is silent or ambiguous on the international aspects, a careful and measured consideration of relevant international case law and scholarly commentary can be employed as persuasive authority. This approach acknowledges the primacy of federal law, while recognizing that international legal principles can offer valuable insights into the interpretation of federal statutes that engage with international norms or criminal conduct with international dimensions. The justification for this approach rests on the principle that courts should strive to interpret statutes in a manner consistent with the broader legal landscape, including international norms, where such consistency does not contradict clear federal statutory language or established federal judicial interpretation. This aligns with the general judicial philosophy of seeking to interpret domestic law in a way that is harmonious with international obligations and principles, where applicable and not otherwise precluded by domestic law. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on Alabama state court decisions that may not have directly addressed the international dimensions of the federal statute. This fails to acknowledge the supremacy of federal law and the potential for federal courts to interpret the statute differently based on international considerations. Another incorrect approach would be to uncritically adopt international case law without considering its direct applicability to the specific federal statute and the factual matrix before the Alabama court. This risks misapplying international principles and exceeding the interpretive authority of a state court. Furthermore, an approach that prioritizes international precedent over clear federal statutory language or established federal judicial interpretation would be a significant ethical and legal failure, violating the principle of judicial hierarchy and the Supremacy Clause. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a hierarchical approach to legal authority. First, identify and apply binding federal statutory language and controlling federal appellate court decisions. Second, if federal precedent is absent or ambiguous, consider persuasive federal authority, including decisions from other federal circuits or scholarly commentary on federal law. Third, only then, and with extreme caution, consider relevant international case law and principles as persuasive authority, ensuring that their application is consistent with the federal statute's text, legislative intent, and established principles of U.S. federal law. This systematic approach ensures that domestic legal obligations are met, while allowing for informed interpretation informed by the broader international legal context. Question 12. The risk matrix shows a pattern of alleged severe human rights violations occurring in a foreign nation, involving systematic targeting of a civilian population. A financial advisor licensed in Alabama is reviewing transactions related to entities potentially involved in these activities. Considering the principles of international criminal law, how should the Alabama licensed financial advisor approach the assessment of these alleged violations in relation to their professional duties? Option A. Analyze the alleged conduct against the established elements of international crimes like crimes against humanity, recognizing that, while Alabama law may not directly prosecute these acts, Understanding their international legal status is crucial for identifying broader risks and potential reporting considerations. Option B. Focus solely on whether the transactions violate Alabama's anti-money laundering laws, disregarding the underlying nature of the alleged human rights violations as irrelevant to financial advisory duties. Option C. Immediately report all alleged human rights violations to Alabama state authorities, assuming any severe misconduct automatically falls under state criminal jurisdiction. Option D. Conclude that since the alleged violations occurred in a foreign nation and are not explicitly defined as crimes under Alabama statutes, they are outside the scope of professional concern for an Alabama-licensed financial advisor. The correct answer is A. Analyze the alleged conduct against the established elements of international crimes like crimes against humanity, recognizing that, while Alabama law may not directly prosecute these acts, understanding their international legal status is crucial for identifying broader risks and potential reporting considerations. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent complexities of international criminal law and the specific context of Alabama's regulatory environment, which, while not directly prosecuting international crimes, must be mindful of the principles and potential implications for individuals and entities operating within its jurisdiction. The challenge lies in distinguishing between acts that may constitute international crimes and those that fall solely under domestic jurisdiction, requiring a nuanced understanding of both international legal frameworks and Alabama's specific laws and ethical obligations for professionals. Careful judgment is required to avoid mischaracterizing conduct and to ensure appropriate reporting or action is taken, if any, within the bounds of professional responsibility. The best approach involves a thorough analysis of the alleged conduct against the established elements of international crimes as defined by international treaties and customary international law, recognizing that Alabama courts would typically prosecute under state or federal law unless specific international cooperation mechanisms are invoked. This approach is correct because it prioritizes a precise legal definition of international crimes, such as war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide, by examining the intent, context, and scale of the alleged actions. Professionals must understand that, while Alabama law may not directly criminalize these acts, awareness of their international legal status is crucial for identifying potential reporting obligations or for advising clients on broader legal risks. This aligns with general ethical principles of due diligence and professional competence, ensuring that advice and actions are grounded in accurate legal understanding, even when the direct enforcement mechanism is outside the state's immediate purview. An incorrect approach would be to assume that any severe or widespread human rights abuses automatically constitute international crimes prosecutable within Alabama. It fails to recognize that international crimes have specific legal definitions and require a particular context, e.g., widespread or systematic attacks against a civilian population, or in the context of armed conflict. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss any conduct not explicitly defined as a crime under Alabama statutes, regardless of its potential international legal classification. This ignores the possibility of international cooperation or the broader ethical implications of facilitating or overlooking acts that are universally condemned as grave offenses. Furthermore, an approach that focuses solely on potential financial penalties or civil remedies under Alabama law, without considering the criminal nature of the alleged conduct on an international scale, is also flawed. This overlooks the gravity of international crimes and the distinct legal and ethical considerations they entail. Professional decision-making in similar situations should involve a structured process. First, clearly identify the alleged conduct. Second, research and understand the definitions and elements of relevant international crimes. Third, assess whether the conduct, based on its nature, context, and scale, appears to meet these international legal definitions. Fourth, consider any applicable reporting obligations under professional codes of conduct or specific regulation, even if direct prosecution within Alabama is unlikely. Finally, seek specialized legal counsel if the situation involves complex international law issues to ensure compliance with all ethical and legal duties. Question 13. Implementation of international criminal law principles within Alabama's legal framework has been a gradual process influenced by global developments, Which of the following historical analyses best captures the nuanced development of Alabama's engagement with international criminal law, considering its unique legal context? Option A. A review of current international criminal law doctrines, without a specific focus on their historical reception or adaptation within Alabama's legal history. Option B. A broad overview of international law's influence on Alabama, without distinguishing the specific historical trajectory of international criminal law from other areas of international legal norms. Option C. An assumption that Alabama's legal system has automatically adopted all universally recognized principles of international criminal law as they have been established globally. Option D. A comparative study examining how major international criminal law milestones, such as the post-World War Roman II tribunals and the Rome Statute, have been historically reflected in Alabama's legislative enactments, judicial precedents, and legal discourse. Correct answer is D. A comparative study examining how major international criminal law milestones, such as the post-World War Roman II tribunals and the Rome Statute, have been historically reflected in Alabama's legislative enactments, judicial precedents, and legal discourse. Explanation: the implementation of international criminal law within Alabama, particularly concerning its historical development and the evolution of its foundational principles, presents a unique challenge. Professionals must navigate the interplay between Alabama's specific legal traditions and the broader trajectory of international justice mechanisms. This requires a nuanced understanding of how international norms have been received, adapted, or sometimes resisted within the state's legal framework. The challenge lies in accurately contextualizing Alabama's engagement with international criminal law, distinguishing between genuine adoption of principles and superficial alignment, and recognizing the historical forces that shape these developments. The most professionally sound approach involves a comparative analysis that meticulously traces the historical influences on Alabama's legal system concerning international criminal law. This means examining how key international developments, such as the Nuremberg trials, the establishment of the International Criminal Court, and the evolution of concepts like universal jurisdiction, have been reflected or addressed within Alabama's legislative history, judicial decisions, and legal scholarship. This approach is correct because it grounds the understanding in empirical evidence and historical progression, allowing for an accurate assessment of Alabama's specific journey in relation to international criminal law. It respects the principle of jurisdictional specificity by focusing on how Alabama has historically engaged with these international concepts, rather than assuming a direct or uniform adoption. An incorrect approach would be to assume that Alabama's legal framework has automatically and fully incorporated all principles of international criminal law as they emerged globally. This overlooks the distinct legislative and judicial processes within a state, which may lead to selective adoption, adaptation, or even rejection of certain international norms. Such an approach fails to acknowledge the historical context and the specific legal and political realities that shape a state's engagement with international law. Another professionally unsound approach would be to focus solely on the current state of international criminal law without considering its historical development and how it has influenced or been influenced by Alabama's legal past. This neglects the crucial aspect of historical context, which is essential for understanding the origins and evolution of legal principles within a specific jurisdiction. It risks presenting a static or incomplete picture, failing to capture the dynamic nature of legal development. Finally, an approach that conflates international criminal law with general international law, without specific attention to the unique characteristics and historical trajectory of criminal justice mechanisms at the international level, would also be flawed. This broad generalization fails to address the specific historical milestones and challenges inherent in the development and implementation of international criminal law within a particular state like Alabama. Professionals should employ a systematic, historically informed, and jurisdictionally specific analytical framework. This involves researching primary legal sources within Alabama statutes, case law, secondary sources, legal commentary, historical analyses, and relevant international legal documents, while always maintaining a critical perspective on the degree and nature of influence. The process requires distinguishing between direct legislative incorporation, judicial interpretation, and the broader influence of international norms on legal thinking. Question 14. To address the challenge of classifying a series of severe human rights violations occurring within Alabama against a specific ethnic minority group, including forced displacement, destruction of cultural heritage sites, and widespread incitement to hatred, what is the most legally sound and ethically responsible course of action for an investigator? Option A. Conduct a detailed investigation to determine if the actions were undertaken with the specific intent to destroy, in whole or in part, the targeted ethnic minority group, as defined by Alabama law, by meticulously examining evidence of planning, policy, and the direct aim of elimination. Option B. Immediately classify the events as genocide due to the severity of the human rights abuses and the scale of suffering experienced by the ethnic minority group. Option C. Rely on media reports and public opinion within Alabama to ascertain whether the events are widely considered to be genocide, and proceed with that classification. Option D. Focus solely on documenting the atrocities and the resulting suffering of the victims, as this clearly demonstrates the genocidal nature of the acts. The correct answer is A. Conduct a detailed investigation to determine if the actions were undertaken with the specific intent to destroy, in whole or in part, the targeted ethnic minority group, as defined by Alabama law, by meticulously examining evidence of planning, policy, and the direct aim of elimination. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires distinguishing between acts that, while abhorrent, may not meet the specific legal threshold for genocide under Alabama law, and those that do. The gravity of the accusation necessitates meticulous adherence to legal definitions and evidence. Mischaracterizing actions as genocide can lead to severe legal and reputational consequences, while failing to identify genuine acts of genocide would be a profound ethical and legal failure. The correct approach involves a rigorous analysis of the alleged actions against the specific elements of the definition of genocide as codified in Alabama law, particularly focusing on the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. This requires examining whether the actions, such as systematic persecution, forced displacement, or incitement to hatred, were undertaken with the specific intent to eliminate the targeted group. The legal framework in Alabama, drawing from international principles but applied within its own statutes, mandates this precise evidentiary standard. An incorrect approach would be to label widespread human rights abuses or severe acts of violence as genocide solely based on their brutality or scale, without demonstrating the specific intent to destroy a protected group. This fails to respect the legal definition, which is narrower than general atrocities. Another incorrect approach would be to focus on the suffering of the victims without establishing the perpetrator's specific intent to destroy the group. While the suffering is undeniable and may constitute other crimes, it does not automatically equate to genocide. Finally, an approach that relies on public outcry or emotional appeals rather than concrete evidence of intent and group targeting would be legally unsound and professionally irresponsible. Professionals facing such situations must employ a structured decision-making process. This begins with a thorough understanding of the relevant legal definitions, in this case, Alabama's statutes pertaining to genocide. Next, they must meticulously gather and analyze all available evidence, critically assessing whether it supports the specific intent element required by law. This involves distinguishing between acts of violence, persecution, or discrimination, and those that are part of a plan or policy to destroy a protected group. Legal counsel and expert consultation are crucial to ensure accurate interpretation and application of the law. Question 15. The review process indicates that during a joint training exercise conducted by Alabama National Guard units in a designated international zone, observations suggest a deliberate targeting of a civilian medical facility. What is the most appropriate course of action for an Alabama National Guard officer who witnesses this event, considering the principles of international humanitarian law as they might be applied within the context of Alabama's regulatory framework for its military personnel? Option A. Assume the targeting was a legitimate military necessity based on intelligence not available to the observer and take no further action, as operational decisions are beyond the scope of junior officers. Option B. Initiate immediate, unauthorized retaliatory measures against perceived perpetrators to prevent further harm, based on the visual evidence of the attack on the medical facility. Option C. Discreetly ignore the incident to avoid potential complications or disciplinary action for reporting a sensitive event that might be deemed an error in judgment by superiors. Option D. Immediately and thoroughly document all observed details of the targeting, including the nature of the facility, the type of munitions used, and any visible civilian casualties, and report these findings through official military channels for investigation under applicable Alabama and international law. The correct answer is D. Immediately and thoroughly document all observed details of the targeting, including the nature of the facility, the type of munitions used, and any visible civilian casualties, and report these findings through official military channels for investigation under applicable Alabama and international law. Explanation. The review process indicates a critical scenario involving potential war crimes under Alabama law, specifically concerning the targeting of civilians. This situation is professionally challenging because it demands immediate and precise application of international humanitarian law principles, as interpreted and potentially enforced within Alabama's legal framework, while balancing operational demands with fundamental ethical obligations. The gravity of alleged war crimes requires a meticulous approach to evidence gathering and reporting, ensuring that any actions taken are consistent with the Alabama Code and international norms against such atrocities. The correct approach involves meticulously documenting all observed actions, specifically noting any instances where civilian infrastructure or individuals appear to be deliberately targeted, and immediately reporting these observations through established military or law enforcement channels that are equipped to handle such allegations under Alabama's jurisdiction. This aligns with the duty to report potential violations of international humanitarian law and ensures that appropriate investigative bodies, which may include state-level authorities in Alabama if jurisdiction is established, can assess the situation. The Alabama Code, while primarily domestic, would be interpreted in light of international law principles when dealing with acts that constitute war crimes, particularly if Alabama-based personnel or resources are involved. The ethical imperative is to prevent further harm and ensure accountability. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss or ignore observed actions that appear to target civilians, under the assumption that they are either unavoidable collateral damage or not within one's purview to report. This failure to document and report potential war crimes directly violates the obligation to uphold international humanitarian law and could lead to complicity in atrocities. Another incorrect approach is to take immediate, unauthorized retaliatory action based on suspicion alone, without proper investigation or adherence to established protocols. This bypasses due process and could itself constitute a violation of law, potentially leading to further civilian harm and undermining the principles of justice. Finally, attempting to conceal or alter evidence related to suspected war crimes is a severe ethical and legal breach, obstructing justice and demonstrating a profound disregard for human rights and the rule of law. Professionals facing such situations should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes adherence to legal and ethical guidelines. This involves 1. Situational awareness, recognizing the potential for war crimes. 2. Information gathering, meticulously documenting observations without bias. 3. Protocol adherence, following established reporting procedures for suspected violations. 4. Seeking guidance, consulting with legal advisors or superiors when uncertainty exists. 5. Ethical imperative, acting to prevent harm and uphold justice. Question 16. Examination of the data shows that an attorney in Alabama is prosecuting a case involving international criminal activity, and a critical piece of evidence has been obtained from a foreign nation. The attorney is aware that this evidence was deemed admissible in the foreign jurisdiction where it was collected. Considering the specific legal landscape of Alabama, what is the most prudent course of action to ensure this evidence can be used in the Alabama court? Option A. Thoroughly research Alabama's rules of evidence and relevant case law regarding the admissibility of foreign obtained evidence, and proactively work with the prosecution team and potentially the court to establish a protocol for its presentation that meets Alabama's legal standards. Option B. Assume that because the evidence was admissible in the foreign jurisdiction, it will automatically be admissible in Alabama, and present it without further inquiry into Alabama's specific evidentiary requirements. Option C. Ignore any potential challenges to the evidence's admissibility under Alabama law and proceed with the prosecution, assuming the court will accept the evidence as presented. Option D. Submit the foreign evidence directly to the Alabama court without any attempt to authenticate it or establish a chain of custody according to Alabama's rules of evidence, relying on its foreign origin as sufficient proof of its validity. The correct answer is A. Thoroughly research Alabama's rules of evidence and relevant case law regarding the admissibility of foreign obtained evidence, and proactively work with the prosecution team and potentially the court to establish a protocol for its presentation that meets Alabama's legal standards. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an Alabama attorney specializing in international criminal law due to the inherent complexities of applying Alabama's procedural rules and evidentiary standards to evidence obtained from a foreign jurisdiction, particularly when that evidence is crucial for a domestic prosecution. The attorney must navigate potential conflicts between Alabama's rules of evidence and discovery and the legal frameworks of the foreign nation where the evidence was gathered. The core challenge lies in ensuring the admissibility and integrity of foreign obtained evidence within the Alabama court system, respecting both Alabama law and principles of international comity. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves meticulously researching and understanding the specific Alabama rules of evidence and Alabama rules of criminal procedure that govern the admissibility of evidence, especially evidence obtained from foreign sources. This includes identifying any relevant Alabama case law that has addressed the admission of such evidence, particularly concerning chain of custody, authentication, and potential hearsay exceptions. The attorney must then proactively engage with the prosecution team, and if necessary, the court to establish a clear protocol for obtaining and presenting this evidence that satisfies Alabama's legal requirements. This might involve seeking judicial guidance on the admissibility of specific types of foreign evidence or exploring avenues for formal international cooperation, if permitted and appropriate under Alabama law and any applicable treaties. This approach is correct because it prioritizes adherence to the governing legal framework of Alabama, ensuring that any evidence presented meets the standards required for a fair trial within the state's jurisdiction. It demonstrates due diligence and a commitment to upholding the integrity of the judicial process. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that evidence admissible in the foreign jurisdiction will automatically be admissible in Alabama. This fails to recognize that Alabama courts are bound by Alabama's rules of evidence and case law, which may have different standards for admissibility, authentication, or chain of custody. Relying solely on foreign legal standards risks the evidence being deemed inadmissible, jeopardizing the prosecution. Another incorrect approach is to present the foreign evidence without any attempt to authenticate or establish its chain of custody according to Alabama standards, simply submitting it as obtained. This directly violates Alabama's evidentiary rules and would likely lead to the evidence being excluded. A further incorrect approach is to disregard the potential for challenges to the evidence's admissibility and proceed as if no issues exist. This demonstrates a lack of professional diligence and an abdication of the attorney's responsibility to ensure the evidence meets legal requirements, potentially leading to a mistrial or dismissal of charges. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this situation should employ a structured decision-making process. First, they must identify the governing legal framework, which in this case is Alabama's rules of evidence and criminal procedure. Second, they should conduct thorough research into relevant Alabama case law concerning the admissibility of foreign obtained evidence. Third, they must assess the specific nature of the foreign evidence and the methods by which it was obtained to determine potential admissibility challenges under Alabama law. Fourth, they should develop a strategy to address these challenges, which may involve pretrial motions, seeking judicial clarification, or working with opposing counsel to stipulate to certain facts. Finally, they must be prepared to present a compelling argument for the evidence's admissibility, grounded in Alabama's legal principles. Question 17. Upon reviewing a potential new client's case in Alabama, a legal professional learns that the client is seeking assistance in structuring complex international financial transactions that, while presented as legitimate business ventures, involve entities and jurisdictions known to be associated with the financing of international terrorism. The client insists that their activities are legal and that the professional need only focus on the transactional mechanics. What is the most ethically and legally sound approach for the legal professional to take in this situation, considering Alabama's regulatory framework and the principles of international criminal law. Option A. Advise the client on how to structure the transactions to avoid direct legal scrutiny within Alabama, without independently verifying the ultimate purpose or beneficiaries of the funds. Option B. Proceed with representing the client based on their assurances of legality, focusing solely on the transactional mechanics as requested, and avoid delving into the broader context of the client's business dealings. Option C. Immediately withdraw from the potential representation without further inquiry, citing a general concern about the nature of the client's business, without providing any specific reasoning to the client. Option D. Conduct thorough due diligence to investigate the legitimacy of the client's proposed transactions and the associated entities, and if a reasonable risk of facilitating international criminal activity is identified, decline representation or withdraw from the engagement. The correct answer is D. Conduct thorough due diligence to investigate the legitimacy of the client's proposed transactions and the associated entities, and if a reasonable risk of facilitating international criminal activity is identified, decline representation or withdraw from the engagement. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between a client's desire for legal representation and the potential for that representation to facilitate ongoing international criminal activity, particularly in the context of Alabama's legal framework and its interaction with international norms. The core difficulty lies in balancing the duty of zealous advocacy with the imperative to avoid aiding or abetting criminal conduct, which carries significant ethical and legal ramifications under both state and international principles. Careful judgment is required to navigate these competing obligations. The correct approach involves a thorough and objective assessment of the client's stated intentions and the nature of the alleged activities. This includes conducting due diligence to ascertain whether the client's proposed actions, even if framed as legitimate business, could reasonably be construed as contributing to or concealing international crimes. If such a risk is identified, the legal professional must decline representation or, if already engaged, withdraw from the matter in a manner that does not prejudice the client unnecessarily, but effectively severs the professional relationship from any involvement in illicit activities. This aligns with the ethical obligations of legal professionals in Alabama, which, while upholding the right to counsel, also prohibit knowingly assisting in illegal or fraudulent conduct. Furthermore, adherence to principles of international criminal law, such as the prohibition against aiding and abetting, necessitates a proactive stance against facilitating such crimes. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with representation solely based on the client's assurances, without independent verification or due diligence, especially when the alleged activities are of a nature that commonly implicates international criminal law. This failure to investigate and assess risk could inadvertently lead to the legal professional becoming complicit in international crimes, violating ethical duties, and potentially incurring legal liability. Another incorrect approach is to withdraw from representation without adequately considering the implications for the client or the potential for the client to seek representation from less scrupulous counsel who might actively facilitate criminal acts. While withdrawal is sometimes necessary, it must be done thoughtfully and ethically. Finally, attempting to look the other way or provide advice that skirts the edges of legality without actively probing the client's true intentions is also professionally unacceptable, as it fails to uphold the integrity of the legal profession and the principles of justice. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes a risk-based assessment. This involves 1. Understanding the client's objectives and the factual context. 2. Identifying potential legal and ethical red flags, particularly those related to international criminal law. 3. Conducting reasonable due diligence to verify the legitimacy of the client's proposed actions. 4. Consulting ethical rules and relevant case law. And 5. Making a clear decision to represent, decline, or withdraw based on the assessment, always prioritizing compliance with legal and ethical obligations. Question 18. When evaluating the potential impact of an international agreement on a client's business operations within Alabama, what is the most appropriate method for determining the agreement's legal enforceability and scope within the state? Option A. Primarily consult Alabama state statutes and administrative regulations, assuming they represent the definitive legal framework for business activities. Option B. Focus exclusively on the plain language of the international agreement, disregarding any subsequent U.S. federal or state legal interpretations. Option C. Assume that any signed international agreement, regardless of U.S. ratification, directly imposes obligations on businesses operating within Alabama. Option D. Ascertain the treaty's ratification status by the U.S. Senate and examine relevant U.S. federal legislation and judicial interpretations that implement its provisions. The correct answer is D. Ascertain the treaty's ratification status by the U.S. Senate and examine relevant U.S. federal legislation and judicial interpretations that implement its provisions. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an Alabama-based legal practitioner advising a client on international trade. The core difficulty lies in navigating the complexities of international law, specifically how treaties ratified by the United States, and thus binding on Alabama, interact with domestic Alabama law and the client's specific business interests. Misinterpreting the scope or applicability of a treaty can lead to significant legal and financial repercussions for the client, including potential violations of international obligations and domestic sanctions. Careful judgment is required to accurately assess the treaty's impact and advise the client accordingly. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough examination of the specific treaty in question, its enabling legislation within the United States, and any relevant implementing regulations or judicial interpretations. This approach recognizes that treaties, once ratified by the U.S. Senate, become the supreme law of the land, superseding conflicting state laws under the Supremacy Clause of the U.S. Constitution. Therefore, understanding the precise obligations and rights conferred by the treaty and how these have been integrated into U.S. federal law is paramount. This ensures that advice provided to the client is legally sound and compliant with both international commitments and domestic legal frameworks applicable within Alabama. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to solely rely on Alabama state statutes and regulations, assuming they are the sole governing authority. This fails to acknowledge the Supremacy Clause and the binding nature of ratified treaties on all U.S. states. Such an approach risks advising the client in a manner that directly contravenes federal law derived from an international treaty, leading to potential legal challenges and penalties. Another incorrect approach is to assume that any international agreement, regardless of its ratification status by the U.S. Senate, has direct applicability and binding force within Alabama. Treaties only become binding law in the U.S. upon ratification by the Senate and, in some cases, further implementing legislation. Ignoring this procedural requirement means misrepresenting the legal status of the agreement and providing flawed advice. A further incorrect approach is to interpret the treaty's provisions in isolation without considering how U.S. courts or federal agencies have interpreted or applied similar treaty language in past cases or regulations. This can lead to an incomplete or inaccurate understanding of the treaty's practical implications and enforcement mechanisms within the U.S. legal system. Professional reasoning. Professionals in Alabama advising on matters involving international law must adopt a hierarchical approach to legal authority. They should first identify any relevant international treaties ratified by the United States. Subsequently, they must ascertain whether these treaties have been incorporated into U.S. federal law through legislation or judicial interpretation. The Supremacy Clause dictates that valid federal law, including treaties, preempts conflicting state law. Therefore, the analysis must prioritize the treaty's provisions and their federal implementation over any potentially conflicting Alabama state laws. This systematic evaluation ensures compliance with the highest applicable legal standards and protects the client from legal jeopardy. Question 19. The analysis reveals that a company based in Alabama is expanding its operations into several developing nations, engaging in supply chain activities that could be impacted by evolving international ethical standards. The company's legal counsel in Alabama is tasked with advising on compliance and risk mitigation. Considering the non-binding nature of many international guidelines, how should the counsel best advise the client regarding their obligations and potential risks stemming from these evolving global norms? Option A. Advise the client to focus exclusively on current Alabama state and federal laws, as international soft law has no bearing on a company operating within the jurisdiction of Alabama. Option B. Advise the client that since these international soft law instruments are not legally binding in Alabama, they can be disregarded for the purposes of compliance and risk assessment. Option C. Advise the client to implement all recommendations found in international soft law instruments as if they were mandatory legal requirements to ensure maximum compliance and avoid any potential future scrutiny. Option D. Advise the client to conduct a thorough assessment of relevant international soft law instruments, such as OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises or UN guiding principles on business and human rights, to understand their potential influence on future regulatory developments, investor expectations, and reputational risks, even though they are not directly enforceable as Alabama law. The correct answer is D. Advise the client to conduct a thorough assessment of relevant international soft law instruments, such as OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises or UN guiding principles on business and human rights, to understand their potential influence on future regulatory developments, investor expectations, and reputational risks, even though they are not directly enforceable as Alabama law. Explanation. The analysis reveals a scenario where a legal practitioner in Alabama is advising a client on international business dealings that may be impacted by evolving global norms. The challenge lies in navigating the interplay between binding international law and the persuasive, yet non-binding, influence of soft law instruments, particularly when advising on compliance and risk mitigation in a jurisdiction like Alabama, which, while not directly creating international law, is where the client's operations are based and where domestic legal implications may arise. The practitioner must distinguish between enforceable legal obligations and aspirational standards that, while not legally binding, can shape future legal developments and influence judicial interpretation. The best approach involves a comprehensive assessment of the client's specific international activities and their potential exposure to both hard and soft law. This includes identifying relevant soft law instruments, such as UN guidelines or OECD recommendations, that address the client's sector or operational areas. The practitioner should then analyze how these instruments, while not directly enforceable in Alabama courts, might inform the interpretation of existing Alabama or federal laws, influence the development of new regulations, or be considered by international bodies or foreign courts in assessing compliance. Ethical duty of competence requires the practitioner to understand these evolving standards and advise the client on potential future risks and best practices, even if not strictly legally mandated. This proactive advisory role helps the client mitigate reputational damage and anticipate future legal landscapes. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss soft law instruments entirely as non-binding and therefore irrelevant to the client's legal obligations. This fails to recognize the persuasive authority and potential future impact of these instruments. Such an approach could lead to a client operating in a manner that, while technically compliant with current hard law, exposes them to significant future legal, regulatory, or reputational risks as soft law norms become increasingly influential. This oversight constitutes a failure in the duty of competence and diligent representation. Another incorrect approach would be to treat soft law instruments as if they were binding legal obligations, advising the client to comply with them as if they were statutes or court orders. This misrepresents the legal status of soft law and could lead to unnecessary compliance burdens or misallocation of resources. It also fails to accurately assess the client's actual legal exposure, potentially overstating or mischaracterizing risks. A further incorrect approach would be to focus solely on Alabama state law and ignore any international consideration, even when the client is engaged in international business. While Alabama law governs the client's operations within the state, international soft law can indirectly influence the business environment and potential liabilities, especially for companies with global reach. Ignoring these external influences, even if indirect, can lead to incomplete and potentially detrimental advice. Professionals should adopt a framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the client's business and its international footprint. This should be followed by a diligent research process to identify all relevant legal frameworks, including both binding international law and influential soft law instruments. The practitioner must then critically analyze the potential impact of these instruments on the client's operations, considering both current legal obligations and future risks. Clear communication with the client about the nature and enforceability of different standards is paramount, enabling informed decision-making regarding compliance and risk management. Question 20. Comparative studies suggest that determining restitution for victims of international crimes can be complex. In a hypothetical scenario involving the misappropriation of state assets valued at $5,000,000 USD by a former official, which occurred 15 years ago in a jurisdiction with an average annual inflation rate of 2.5%. What would be the most appropriate calculation for restitution to ensure victims are made whole, considering Alabama's adherence to international principles of restorative justice? Option A. Apply a fixed 10% annual return on the original value for the entire period. Option B. Award the original value of the misappropriated assets without any adjustments. Option C. Calculate the adjusted value using the formula. Adjusted value equals original value asterisk 1 plus inflation rate, number of years. Option D. Use an average of the original value and a speculative future value of the assets. Correct answer is C. Calculate the adjusted value using the formula. Adjusted value equals original value asterisk 1 plus inflation rate, number of years. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent complexity of calculating damages in international criminal law, particularly when dealing with restitution for victims of state-sponsored crimes. The need to quantify financial losses, count for inflation, and consider potential future economic impacts requires meticulous attention to detail and adherence to established legal and economic principles. Miscalculations can lead to inadequate compensation for victims or unjust enrichment for perpetrators, undermining the principles of justice and accountability. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a multifaceted approach to calculating restitution. This includes 1. Establishing a baseline value of the stolen or destroyed assets at the time of the offense. 2. Applying a recognized inflation adjustment factor to account for the time value of money. And 3. Incorporating a reasonable rate of return or economic growth projection, where applicable and legally permissible under Alabama law for international criminal restitution. This method ensures that the restitution awarded reflects the true economic loss suffered by the victims, considering the erosion of purchasing power and potential lost earnings. The specific formula for calculating the adjusted value would be adjusted value equals original value asterisk 1 plus inflation rate, number of years. For instance, if assets valued at $1,000,000 were stolen 10 years ago, and the average annual inflation rate was 3%, the adjusted value would be \1,000,000 times 1 plus 0.03 10 \. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to simply award the original value of the stolen assets without any adjustment for inflation or lost economic opportunity. This fails to acknowledge the time value of money and would result in a significant underestimation of the actual loss suffered by the victims, violating principles of full restitution. Another incorrect approach would be to apply an arbitrary or excessively high rate of return to the original value, exceeding what could be reasonably expected in the relevant economic climate. This could lead to an unjust enrichment for the victims and potentially be seen as punitive rather than compensatory, deviating from the core purpose of restitution in international criminal law as interpreted within Alabama's framework for international cooperation. A further incorrect approach would be to solely rely on expert testimony without independent verification or a clear methodology for calculating the damages. While expert opinions are valuable, they must be grounded in sound financial principles and verifiable data, and the legal framework in Alabama would require a demonstrable and justifiable calculation method. Professional reasoning. Professionals faced with such calculations should adopt a systematic approach. First, thoroughly understand the specific nature of the crime and the assets or losses involved. Second, identify the relevant legal framework in Alabama governing international criminal restitution and damage assessment. Third, gather all necessary data, including original values, historical inflation rates, and relevant economic indicators. Fourth, apply a recognized and legally defensible calculation methodology, such as the adjusted value formula, ensuring transparency and accuracy. Finally, be prepared to justify the calculation methodology and the resulting figures based on legal precedent and economic principles.